Reflections on the Good News of Jesus Christ for the 22nd Sunday of Ordinary Time from the Gospel according to Mark. When the Pharisees with some scribes who had come from Jerusalem gathered around Jesus, they observed that some of his disciples ate their meals with unclean, that is, unwashed hands. For the Pharisees, and in fact all Jews, do not eat without carefully washing their hands, keeping the tradition of the elders. And on coming back from the marketplace, they do not eat without purifying themselves. And there are many other things that they have traditionally observed, the purification of cups and jugs and kettles and beds. So the Pharisees and scribes questioned him, "Why do your disciples not follow the tradition of the elders, but instead eat a meal with unclean hands?" Jesus responded, "Well did Isaiah prophesy about you hypocrites, as it is written, 'This people honors me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines human precepts.' You disregard God's commandment, but cling to human tradition." Jesus summoned the crowd again and said to them, "Hear me, all of you, and understand. Nothing that enters one from outside can defile that person, but the things that come out from within are what defile. From within people, from their hearts, come evil thoughts, unchastity, theft, murder, adultery, greed, malice, deceit, licentiousness, envy, blasphemy, arrogance, folly. All these evils come from within, and they defile." The Gospel of the Lord. A story may help us get to the heart of this gospel, and on this first Sunday of September, what better than a story about starting another school year? On the first day of school, the teacher was given the roster of students in her new class. Near each student's name was a number, such as 154, 136, 142, and so on. The teacher was impressed. "Look at these IQ scores," she thought. "What a terrific class this is going to be." She immediately determined to work harder with this class than with any other class she ever taught. And sure enough, all that year, she came up with innovative lessons that she thought would challenge the students, not wanting to bore them with work that was too easy for them. And the class responded, outperforming every class she ever had. At the end of the year, the principal commended the teacher on what she had accomplished with her students. "Thank you, but how could I miss," the teacher said humbly, "with the IQ scores of my students?" "What IQ scores?" the principal asked. "The IQ scores that were included on my class roster," she said, pointing to her class list. "Those are not their IQ scores," the principal explained. "Those are their locker numbers." As Jesus makes clear in today's gospel, and this teacher discovers, even if by accident, we possess within ourselves the potential to do great things. We also possess the ability to do monstrous things. Who we are, what we believe, how we respond to life's challenges begin within our hearts, the place where God dwells within us. Conversely, the evil we are capable of, the hurt we inflict on others, our degrading of the world God created also begins within our hearts. When God is replaced by selfishness, anger, greed, hatred. Our prayer today might include a request that God open our spirits and consciences to listen to the voice of God speaking to us in our hearts. calling us to compassion instead of judgment, forgiveness instead of vengeance, joy instead of fear, reconciliation instead of division. In today's gospel, we heard Jesus use some of the strongest language he ever uses, and his targets are the scribes and Pharisees. Why them? Weren't they people who devoted themselves to studying the law of God? They were. They were also hypocrites, a Greek word that originally meant actor, someone playing a role, someone pretending to be who they are not. The scribes and Pharisees were faithful to the letter of the law, but neglected the more important things that mattered most to God: mercy, compassion, faithfulness, love. You might see why Jesus called them blind guides, wearing on the outside an actor's mask that bore little resemblance to the inner person. Might that occasionally describe you or me? The law was very important for the people of Israel. They were rightly proud of the legal system they had developed in their desire to be God's people. Through the law, they were expected to lead lives which were different, better than their pagan neighbors. There was then great emphasis on the observance of the law as a sign of commitment and obedience to God. But by the time of Jesus, the law had become so hopelessly complicated in its applications that only experts could interpret it in the many practical problems which would arise in daily living. Another problem had arisen by Jesus' time. The law was no longer a guideline helping people on their way to loving and serving God. Observing the law had become an end in itself. The emphasis was not on building a relationship with God and one's fellow human beings, but on checking out one's own external behavior. That sounds like much of what today passes for sin. Such personal failures as, I lost my temper, I was impatient, I was lazy, I was uncharitable, with very little reference to how I related with other people, or how my actions, or even more, my non-actions, caused others to be hurt. As Jesus tells us, many of the Old Testament laws were of human invention. They had little to do with loving God, but rather of conforming to social demands. On the one hand, they helped those in authority keep control. On the other, people knew where they stood. If they externally observed the law, they were good. As in our time, we might say, they're good Christians, they're always in church on Sunday. The important thing in this approach, in a way, the only thing that matters, is that they are physically present. There is no mention of what they do in church, what they think or feel, or how they relate to the people around them during and especially after the worship service. From what I've observed, real Christianity begins in the church parking lot. The problem is presented in the gospel today by a conflict between Jesus and the Pharisees, but it could just as easily be phrased as a conflict between parents and children. Don't come to the table until you have washed your hands, an issue made even more important in the recent pandemic days. The question really reflects tensions in the early Christian community of Mark, where some of the new Christians were Jews and some were Gentiles. The Gentiles did not follow Jewish customs, and the Jewish Christians were upset. Today's gospel puts these Jewish customs in proper perspective. Of course, washing hands before eating is a very sensible precaution. There were many prescriptions in Jewish law which seemed to be primarily hygienic in origin. For example, the distinction between foods that were clean and unclean. Experience had shown that certain foods could be dangerous to eat, and eating with dirty hands could be a source of disease or sickness. By attaching a religious sanction to recommended behavior, people might pay closer attention. Jesus is not criticizing such precautions. What he is criticizing is the disproportionate importance given to these things to the neglect of what is far more important, the love of God and the care for one's fellow human beings. So Jesus today quotes from the prophet Isaiah, "This people honors me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. Their worship is useless. The doctrines they teach are mere human regulations. They put human traditions before the commandments of God." These words seem directed not against the Pharisees as such, but against rigidly doctrinaire Jewish members of the Christian community. Of course, this is not just an old problem. There are a number of similarly rigid and doctrinaire people in our communities today. Much of that kind of enslavement to culture and tradition is a major source of conflict in our world now, between communities, even within families. Such fundamentalism is a source of terrible hatred and violence in many countries, and it completely contradicts the true meaning of religion. We need to be very much aware of it in our own multi-ethnic, multicultural society. Unfortunately, even with all our high tech, people today appear to have changed very little from those of Jesus' time. Jesus then speaks of where real uncleanness comes from. It is not any food or drink that comes from outside. Once again, real uncleanness, much like real goodness, comes from the heart. A person does not become unclean by eating pork or by coming in contact with blood, still less by not washing hands before eating, but by all those things that set people against each other and that arise in the depths of the heart: stealing, murder, adultery, lust, greed, maliciousness, deceit, jealousy, slander, arrogance. All these are in direct conflict with a genuinely loving relationship with God and people. Washing hands does nothing to change that. The positive command of God's law is to serve God in each other, to walk blamelessly, do justice, and to not harm one's fellow human being. Notice the difference between what the Pharisees and scribes were saying to Jesus and what we have heard from the letter of James. He writes, "Pure, unspoiled religion in the eyes of God is this: coming to the help of orphans and widows when they need it." Why orphans and widows? Because in the ancient world, they were the most vulnerable, or as Pope Francis would say, they are the marginalized. In other words, true religion has little to do with the observance of laws, but rather with being liberated from the corrupting influences of our world and with being sensitive to the needs of the weakest among us. And this is true religion because, as Jesus tells us, as often as you did or did not do it to one of my least of my brothers and sisters, you did or did not do it to me. Yes, it is possible to keep all the laws and rules perfectly, as Pharisees of all kinds do, and yet be very far from the spirit of Jesus and the gospel. The lawkeeper is primarily concerned with saving his or her soul, with being in the state of grace. Even when such people show charity to others, may it not just be simply to get brownie points? This very day, we may well have many opportunities to love and serve Jesus in various situations. Instead of being anxious about what I may do wrong, is it a sin? Ask rather, where and how can I be more loving, caring, and compassionate today? Then go do it. Thanks for listening.